All right, ready to dive into some seriously complex philosophy?
I'm game if you are.
Let's do it. We're tackling Leibniz this time.
Ah, Leibniz.
Specifically, his attempt to, well, wrestle with the problem of evil.
One of the big ones, for sure.
Definitely a heavyweight topic. And we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Leibniz on the problems of evil to guide us. So no easy answers today.
Which is appropriate for Leibniz. He was all about diving deep.
Exactly. And one of his most, shall we say, provocative claims is that this world, with all its warts and flaws, is actually the best possible world,
Yeah, that one tends to raise some eyebrows.
to say the least. But before we get into the why, let's make sure everyone's on the same page about what we mean by the problem of evil.
Right, good point. Because it's not just, hey, bad stuff happens, what's up with that?
Exactly. It's much more philosophically nuanced. Thinkers in Leibniz's time were grappling with two main versions of this problem.
Okay, lay him on me.
So first, you've got what you might call the underachiever problem. Basically, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why isn't the world perfect?
Like God could have done better? Is that the idea?
Exactly. It questions God's abilities, right? Is he not powerful enough to create a world without suffering, or knowledgeable enough to design it perfectly, or good enough to actually want a flawless creation?
Okay, so that's problem number one. What's the other side of this coin?
Well, it's what we might call the holiness problem. This one gets to the heart of God's involvement in creation. If he created everything, doesn't that mean he's responsible for the bad stuff too?
Ah, so this challenges the whole idea of a morally perfect God.
You got it. And Leibniz, bless his heart, actually had responses to both of these problems.
And they were,
Oh, they were both ingenious and controversial, which is what makes exploring them so much fun.
especially for a philosopher. Bring on the controversy.
Challenge accepted. So let's start with the underachiever problem and Leibniz's audacious claim that this, despite everything, is the best of all possible worlds.
All right, let's hear the defense of this supposedly best world. What's his reasoning?
Well, it all hinges on his famous principle of sufficient reason,
Which states?
that everything that exists, every event, every decision, has a reason for being the way it is. Nothing is arbitrary or without cause.
Okay, I see where this is going. An infinite series of ever better worlds doesn't really fit with that, does it? Maybe no ultimate reason for this particular world.
Exactly. There had to be a reason for this world, and for Leibniz, that reason was that it's the best one.
But I think a lot of people would hear that and say, hold on, I can easily imagine worlds that seem better, like a world without, I don't know, the Lisbon earthquake. Seems like a pretty clear improvement.
Right, it's a natural objection. And, folks have been pointing out seemingly better worlds since Leibniz's day. But he had a pretty clever two-part rebuttal.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay on me.
First, he argued that we, as limited humans, simply don't see the whole picture, the full tapestry of consequences.
It's like we're looking at one thread and judging the whole thing based on that.
Exactly. Removing one thread, even one that seems bad, could unravel the entire pattern in ways we can't even begin to fathom. What seems like an improvement to us might actually make things worse overall.
Okay, I can see how that's kind of a humbling thought. What was his second point?
Well, he suggested that our very idea of what's good might be too limited. We tend to focus on things like human happiness, right? But what if God's judging the world on a whole different set of standards, ones that go far beyond our comprehension?
So maybe what seems like a better world to us wouldn't actually be better according to God's grand plan.
Exactly. It's like judging a complex piece of art solely on how much you like the colors without understanding the composition, the technique, the artist's intent.
That's a good analogy. It makes you realize how little we might actually know about what makes a world truly good in the grand scheme of things.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting because even scholars who study Leibniz debate about what he actually considered best.
Oh, so there's disagreement about what his criteria for best even were.
Exactly. Some think he was all about maximizing happiness, especially for rational beings like us. Others point to his idea of maximizing diversity in creation as a way of reflecting the richness of God's perfections.
Makes sense. The more diverse and complex the world, the more it shows off God's creative power.
Right. And still, others focus on this balance he talks about between complex phenomena and the simplicity of the laws that govern them. Like the world is this incredibly intricate thing, but it runs on these elegantly simple principles.
So maybe it's not about just one thing, but a combination of all these factors.
That's definitely a possibility. And this is precisely what makes it so hard to argue that this isn't the best possible world, at least by Leibniz's standards.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this best possible world idea works, even if it doesn't totally sit right. But what about the other side of the problem of evil?
Ah, here's the holiness problem. The one that asks, if God made everything, how can he not be the author of evil?
The million-dollar question. How did Leibniz handle that one?
Well, buckle up, because this is where things get even more philosophically twisty. So we ended last time on a bit of a cliffhanger. How does Leibniz deal with the holiness problem, the question of how a perfect God could be involved in a world where evil exists.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Some thinkers back then used what they called the privation argument.
Privation? What's that?
It's basically the idea that evil isn't a thing in itself, but rather an absence of good. Like darkness is just the absence of light, or a hole is just the absence of, donut.
Okay, I get the analogy. So they're saying evil's not something God created, it's just a lack of something.
Exactly. But Leibniz wasn't initially buying it.
Really? Why not? Seems like a pretty convenient way out.
Well, he argued that even the absence of something is still part of the creator's design. He used a painting analogy. Imagine a painter makes two versions of the same painting.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
One's bigger, one's smaller, but the painter's still the author of both versions, right? Including what's missing in the smaller one.
Ah, so even the lack is part of the creation. Makes sense, but then wouldn't that still make God responsible for the evil, even if it's just a lack?
That's the dilemma. And to address it, Leibniz introduced this really important distinction between permission and decree.
Permission versus decree. Okay, break that down for me.
So when God decrees something, he's actively willing it into being. Think of it like a king issuing a command. It must happen. That's how God creates good things, according to Leibniz.
All right, so good stuff is directly decreed by God. What about evil?
Evil, he says, is merely permitted. God doesn't want it, but he allows it to happen as a necessary consequence of creating a good world.
So it's like God sets the stage, but doesn't script every single action.
Exactly. He creates the possibility for evil, but he doesn't actively will it into being.
Okay, that sort of makes sense. But how does that square with this idea of God as the concurrent cause of everything?
Ah, good point. That's one of the stickiest parts of Leibniz's whole system.
Because if God's actively involved in every action, isn't that pretty much the same as causing those actions, even the evil ones?
Right, that's the challenge. And to really unpack Leibniz's position here, we have to delve into his view of God's knowledge and how it relates to free will.
All right, so we're going even deeper down the rabbit hole. Hit me with it.
So there were some folks back then who held this view called post-volitional. Basically, they believe that God determines what will happen, and then it becomes true.
Meaning God's the one making the choices, even the bad ones.
Right. But obviously, that creates problems for Leibniz.
Huge problems. It makes God the author of evil, which kind of defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly. So the other option is what's called the prevolitional view. This is where the truth of our choices exist independently of God. He knows them, but doesn't determine them.
So it's like God knows the ending of the book, but he didn't write it.
Perfect analogy. But then that raises another issue, doesn't it?
It seems to, yeah. If our choices aren't determined by God, how can there be a sufficient reason for them? Doesn't that contradict his whole principle?
Exactly. And Leibniz definitely recognized this difficulty. It's like he's trying to thread a needle here, find a middle ground between these two extremes.
So what's his solution?
He focuses on the relationship between intellect and will. Like, can we really control our choices by controlling what we perceive as good?
I'm following so far.
And is the will, morally necessitated but not causally determined by the intellect? It gets really tricky.
Hold on. Morally necessitated. What in the philosophical world does that even mean?
Yeah, even Leibniz scholars debate about this. It's one of those concepts he wrestled with but didn't always explain super clearly.
Philosophers, am I right? Always leaving anything hanging.
But it seems to suggest that while our intellect, our reasoning faculty, naturally guides us towards what it sees as good, it doesn't force the will to choose that. There's still an element of freedom involved.
So it's like our intellect is giving us directions, but we can still choose to ignore them and take a detour.
Exactly. And because God understands the nature of our intellect and will, he knows what we'll choose even though he doesn't force those choices.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this might fit with his permission solution. God's not decreeing evil, but he's creating beings with the capacity to choose it. But doesn't that still raise questions about how much responsibility God has for the evil that happens?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where things get even more complex because remember, Leibniz eventually revisits that privation argument he initially rejected.
Wait, really? He goes back to saying evil is just the absence of good, like the hole in the donut.
It seems so, and it's a shift that really makes you wonder what was going on in his mind. Did he find flaws in his earlier arguments? Did he discover something new that made him rethink the whole problem?
That's wild. So what's the deal with this change of heart? What prompted him to go back to the privation idea? So last time we were talking about how Leibniz changes his stance on that privation argument, the idea that evil is simply an absence of good.
Right, it's like he did a full 180, went from rejecting it to seemingly embracing it.
What would have caused such a major shift? Did he find his early arguments, not holding up, or did he discover something new that made him rethink things?
It's hard to say for sure. Leibniz, unfortunately, didn't leave us a detailed philosophical diary outlining his every thought process.
More's the pity. But we can speculate a bit, can't we? I mean, maybe grappling with those implications of God's concurrence with every single action, even the bad ones, pushed him to reconsider that privation idea.
Yeah, that's possible. Perhaps framing evil as this absence, this void, allowed for a clearer distinction between a perfect God and the imperfections we see in the world.
So instead of God actively committing evil, it's more like he's creating a world with a built-in potential for evil, like a sort of negative space.
That's a good way to put it. And this shift actually lines up pretty well with Leibniz's emphasis on the metaphysical perfection of God's creation.
How so?
Well, by viewing evil as privation, it doesn't have the same kind of ontological status as good. It's not a thing in itself, created by God, but rather a lack, a deficiency.
So evil's kind of demoted to a second-class citizen in the realm of existence.
In a way, yes. But of course, that raises another question, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Doesn't that kind of downplay the very real experience of evil and suffering? I mean, if it's just an absence, doesn't that make it less significant, less impactful?
It's a valid point, and one that's been debated by philosophers ever since. Leibniz certainly wouldn't deny the very real experience of evil and suffering in the world. He's not saying it's an illusion or that we should just ignore it.
So what's he saying then?
He's suggesting that the root cause of evil, the ultimate source, isn't a perfect God, but rather lies in the limitations and choices of created beings, in our imperfections, so to speak.
Okay, so God creates the potential for good, but the absence of that good, that void, is what we experience as evil. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Is it like saying an artist provides the canvas and the paints, but it's up to the artist, in this case us, to decide whether to paint a masterpiece or, something not so great?
That's an excellent analogy, and it leads to some pretty interesting questions about our own role in all this.
Oh, like what?
Well, if evil is this privation, this lack of good, does that mean we're somehow responsible for bringing it into the world?
Whoa, hold on. Are we saying that every time we make a bad choice, every time something bad happens, it's directly because we failed to fill that void with good?
It's not quite as simple as that. Remember, Leibniz was a huge champion of free will. He believed we have a genuine capacity to choose, to act in accordance with our understanding of good, or to, well, stray from it.
So where does evil fit into that picture?
Evil arises from those choices that turn away from the good, that create disharmony, and disrupt that perfect order God intended. It's like we're given this beautiful melody to play, but we can choose to play it poorly, creating dissonance instead of harmony.
Okay, that helps. So God sets up the potential for good, and we have the freedom to either actualize that potential, make that music beautiful, or let it remain unfulfilled, which results in evil.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that concept of moral necessity we talked about earlier, that tricky relationship between intellect and will.
Right? Because our intellect naturally seeks the good, but we can choose to act against that.
Exactly. It's that element of choice that makes us responsible, that creates the possibility for evil to arise where there should be good.
But if we're accepting this idea of evil as privation, doesn't that make it almost impossible to judge any action as objectively evil? I mean, we're only seeing a tiny sliver of the whole picture, right? What seems bad to us might actually be necessary for the overall good of the universe in ways we can't even comprehend.
That's the paradox Leibniz leaves us with. He believed in this universal moral order, in objective good and evil. But he also acknowledged the limits of our human perspective.
So we can never be 100% certain about anything.
We can strive to act in accordance with good, to make choices that align with what we understand to be right, but we can never fully grasp the entire tapestry, the intricate web of cause and effect that connects every single thing in the universe.
So we're called to do good, but we might accidentally do bad, even with the best intentions. That's a lot to process.
It is, and maybe that's the most important takeaway from Leibniz's exploration of this whole problem of evil. Act with humility, recognizing that we have the capacity for both good and evil, even unintentionally.
It's definitely a humbling thought. Makes you realize how much we don't know.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's the beauty of wrestling with these big philosophical questions. It's not always about finding definitive answers. It's about expanding our understanding, pushing the boundaries of our thinking.
So the next time we find ourselves wondering about the existence of evil in the world, we should remember Leibniz.
Absolutely. His ideas might not provide all the answers, but they offer a really powerful framework for understanding this complex interplay between good and evil, freedom and necessity. It's a reminder that even in this, supposedly best of all possible worlds, things aren't always black and white. There's a lot of gray area to explore.
And maybe that's the point, to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving for a deeper understanding of these age-old dilemmas.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining me on this philosophical journey. It's been a wild ride. And for all you listeners out there, keep those minds engaged and those philosophical fires burning. Until next time.